We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. So let's begin. Then hey, Gavi, that was for you. Right? So although we're not going to begin by quoting the Rebbe, we'll begin by quoting the Mishnah. In our session, let's begin. So we'll say, so remember again, let's begin. So we're speaking still in the topic of Avoda Zara, specifically again at what could be rendered Avoda Zara. So if you have Nachrim, Gentiles who worship a mountain, Ves Hagvos, or the hills, Hein Mutarin Umash She'alei Asurin. So we'll say is we're going to learn, so inanimate objects that, well, actually we'll define the scope of this. But for our purposes right now, both the mountains, or I should say neither the mountains nor the hills can be made into Avoda Zara. So that which is on the mountain or that which is on the hill can be made into Avoda Zara, but the mountain or the hill itself cannot. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, Lo sachmod kesef v'zahav aleihem. The pasuk says, you shall not go ahead. Literally, it means you shall not go ahead and covet. But it means you shall not go ahead and worship the kesef and zahav, the gold and the silver which is upon them. So you see over here that it's only that which is upon the mountain or the hill, not the mountain or the hill itself, which is problematic or which could become Avoda Zara. So the Gemara Rabbi Yossi says, Elohehem al haharim. So we'll say Rabbi Yossi quotes from this. It's the same pasuk, just a different phrase. The pasuk says, "Abeib tabdun es kalam b'kamos asher avdu sham agayim asher atam yosham osam es Elohehem al haharim." Go ahead and destroy their gods on the mountains. So the Gemara that Rabbi Yossi Aglili darshins Elohehem al haharim v'lo haharim Elohehem. That it's only their gods on the mountains, but the mountains themselves cannot become the gods. Elohehem ala gvos, you're not allowed to worship their gods which are on the hills. V'lo hagvos Elohehem. But the hills themselves cannot become the gods. So we'll say, at first glance, it appears that Rabbi Yossi Aglili is saying the same exact thing as the Tanakama. Right? There is no difference between the two of them. I say they're both saying the same thing, which is that the mountains, the hills cannot become Avoda Zara. That which is on the mountains, that which is on the hills can, but the mountains and hills themselves cannot. They just seem to be darshaning it from different places. The Tanakama says, Lo sachmod kesef v'zahav aleihem. Ultimately, the Tanakama says, do not covet the gold and silver that is on them, which indicates to us that it is not the mountain or the hill which could become usher, but rather only that which is upon them. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, Eloheim alaharim, and again, darshaning below aharim Eloheim. But ultimately, the bottom line being the same, that it's only that which is on the mountain which becomes usher b'Avoda Zara, not the mountain itself. I asked the Gemara, asked the Mishnah, Bam Kasha, so we'll say, what about Asherah? What about Asherah? This poses an existential difficulty for us, right? What about the Asherah? So the Asherah, we'll say, remember again, is something that by definition is part of the fixture of the landscape, by definition is part of the earth. Yet again, we see it is Avoda Zara. So we'll say, using what we've just learned before of Losa either Aleihem or Eloheim alaharim Eloharim Eloheim, why would Asherah be aser? We'll say, here we go. Mipnei sheyesh b'tfisas yad adam. Because Rabbi say, literally translated, it has tfisas yad adam. Literally means, like yesterday we would say, it has man's fingerprints on it. The idea is that this item has man's involvement. Rashi says, what does this mean, man's involvement? Sha'adam not o. A person planted it. So I will say, because a person planted it, this is considered to be something created by man. Because it's something created by man, therefore, by definition, it is subject ultimately to being transformed into Avoda Zara. So we'll say, in other words, what the Mishnah seems to be saying is as follows: anything that is naturally formed in this world, by definition, cannot be transformed into a chefza, into an object of Avoda Zara, even if it is worshipped. So therefore, even if I worship the mountain doesn't become Avoda Zara. The hill doesn't become Avoda Zara. Using that logic, an Asherah, right, which is a tree, which people pray to, which people worship, shouldn't become Avoda Zara either. Elamai, a tree is different. Why, Rabbi Osai? Because the tree was planted by man. Since the tree was planted by man, this is what the Mishnah calls tfisas yedei adam. A person was involved in this, in the creation of this entity. Therefore, this item can be transformed into an object of Avoda Zara. The chol sheyesh ba tfisas yedei adam aser. And I will say whatever ultimately has tfisas yedei adam, whatever was created at least in part by man. Obviously, the tree in its totality is not created by man. The tree is planted and the tree grows on its own. But Lamaisa, since the origin of that tree is something that is done by man, therefore by definition it can be transformed into Avoda Zara. Amar Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva said as follows: Ani ovin va'adon lifanecha. So Rabbi Akiva says, I'm going to darshan. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Akiva, Ani odin va'adon lifanecha, efarish va'adon lifanecha. So Rabbi Akiva says, I'm going to teach you how to darshan this pasuk properly. How do you darshan the pasuk properly? Kol makom sha'ata motzi har gavoa v'giva nisa ve'etz ra'anan da sheyesh sham avodas kochavim. So I'll say Rabbi Akiva understands over here as follows: that in fact the psukim that we mentioned before, are in fact going ahead and giving us the markers as to where to find Avoda Zara. We'll say, what does that mean? The pasuk reads, "Abei tabdunas kala mekamos asher avdu shamagoyim." Destroy all of the places where the Gentiles went ahead and worshipped idolatry. So asher atem yarshimosam. This is the land that you are inheriting. As Eloheim al haharim haramim. They're gods on the tall mountains. Va'ala gvaos, and on the hills. V'tachas kol itz ra'anan. And underneath every, we'll say itz ra'anan literally means every green tree. So Rabbi Akiva comes along, and Rabbi Akiva says, you don't understand. The Torah is not just telling you the obligation to destroy Avodah Zara. How do we know that? Says Rabbi Akiva. Because simple. If the Torah Kedosha was just coming to tell me to destroy Avodah Zara, then what? Coffee line. What's happening back there? There's a lot of guys over there by the machine. And so the Torah could have just said, destroy Avodah Zara. Why do you have to get into on the mountains, on the hills, underneath the tree? Why do you need that? Rabbi Akiva says the Torah is actually giving us geographic markers. The Torah is giving us like Avodah Zara GPS, telling you that, by the way, when you get into Canaan and you have to root out the Avodah Zara, I'm going to tell you where to find the Avodah Zara. The Avodah Zara is on top of the mountains. The Avodah Zara is on top of the trees. On top of the hills. The Avodah Zara is off in the big green trees. So therefore, again, Rabbi Akiva understands the Torah. Rabbi Akiva is lav dafka disagreeing with that which we mentioned before. I mean, he could be very well agreeing with the statements, because the truth is Tanna Kama, Rabbi Yossi, Haglili are not disagreeing. Everybody actually seems to be on the same page. Rabbi Yossi, it's a beautiful day for this Mishnah. It's Purim. It's a day of Achdus, it's a day of Shalom. Mamish, a Mishnah without machlokes. A Mishnah without machlokes. It doesn't get better than this. It's mamish like a spiritual jackpot. It doesn't get better than this. Mishnah without machlokes on a day of Achdus. All Rabbi Akiva is saying is, in addition to the halachic ramifications that the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yossi Halili brought out of the pasuk, there's another piece, which is the Torah Kedosha is identifying for us where to find Avodah Zara, where to find it, in order to root it out. Good. So we'll say, so bottom line, what comes out from the Mishnah is as follows. Leaving aside Rabbi Akiva's drasha, what comes out from the Mishnah is as follows. That halacha l'maisa, even if one worships a mountain or a hill, so one does not transform that object into an entity of Avodah Zara. It is only if one worships that which is on the, by the way, I'll come back to that in a moment. So it's only if one worships that which is on the mountain, that which is on the hill, those objects become Avodah Zara. Asherah is different. Asherah is the exception. Why? Remember this phrase, Mipnei sheyish bat tfisas yedei adam. Because since a person bepashtos was involved in the planting of the tree, therefore by definition a person has the ability to transform the identity of the tree into a cheftza of Avodah Zara. We'll say, just as an aside, what's Rabbi Akiva's logic? Why are they putting the Avodah Zara on top of the mountains, top of the hills? The truth is, they got that from us. Right? They got that from us. Remember again, it's a halacha. What's the halacha? A shul, right? The Beis HaKnesses. I mean, the truth is, the Avodah Zara predated our shuls per se, but a shul, usually, by halacha says, so say the highest place in the city. Historically, that often did not happen because of anti-Semitic persecution. Jews weren't allowed to do that. But in a vacuum, the halacha is the Beis Hashem is always supposed to be placed on the highest point in the particular city. So Avodah Zara borrowed that concept from us as well. Good, says the Gemara. Rabbi Yosef behind Tanna Kama. Oh, so the Gemara asks, our kasha, Rabbi Yosef and Tanna Kama are saying the same thing. Right? We'll say both of them are saying if you worship the mountain, you can't make the mountain into Avoda Zara, but what? You can go ahead and make that which is on the mountain into Avoda Zara. But I will say, we know. See, we know. We've been around the Talmudic block a couple of times. So we know already that if the Mishnah is teaching me two different opinions, then what? Then what? There is a machlokes, meaning they're arguing about something. Because there is no need to quote a Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi Galili if they in fact are saying the same thing. Rabbi Yossi Galili, the Hainu Tanakama, Amar Rabbi Bar Chama, Amar Reish Lakish, Tzipoy har kahar ika ben Arab. So listen to this interesting nafkamina. The nafkamina, the practical difference between the two, I should say the machlokes between the two, is what happens if the mountain is covered in gold. Tzipoy har kahar. We'll say the mountain itself is covered in gold. So the shaila is, let's say then one worships the mountain. So what's the shaila? What's the shaila? All right, good. Right, excellent. So right, the shaila is, what's the status of the covering? Right, to both say, is the covering considered to be part of the mountain or not? Remember again, why a covering? Because a covering is different than, let's say, a statue sitting on top of the mountain. A statue sitting on top of the mountain is clearly a separate and distinct entity. However, again, the coating on the mountain itself, the shaila is it part of the mountain and therefore can't be transformed into Avoda Zara, or is it separate and distinct entity which can't be transformed into Avoda Zara? Tanakama Savar, the Tanakama holds, Tzipoy har eino kehar. Tanakama holds that the covering of the mountain is not like the mountain, and therefore umissar. And therefore, if you worship it, it mamish becomes Avoda Zara. Rabbi Yossi Galili Savar, Tzipoy har harehu kehar. Rabbi Yossi Galili holds that no, the covering of the mountain is mamish like what? Mamish like the mountain itself, and therefore, even if you worship it, the covering does not become asr. We'll say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Tanakama Sarat Tzipoy har eino kehar misar d'chsiv lo sachmot kesef alehem kol shalem. So we'll say the Tanakama's svara is the pasuk says lo sachmot kesef v'zahav alehem. So Tanakama understands that pasuk is coming to cover even this case. Even if the kesef and zav is alehem, even if the kesef and zav literally covers the mountain, still, nevertheless, it is not considered to. It is considered to be like part of the mountain, and therefore, again, not considered to be part of the mountain, separate than the mountain, and therefore becomes asur. Rabbi Yossi, Rashi says, Rabbi Yossi savar tzipoy har kar. Rabbi Yossi Galili holds that the covering of the mountain is like the mountain itself. Batal lagabe har seals that the covering is batal to the mountain itself. The chayvan dahar la'avodas kochavim, and since the mountain can't be turned into a form of idolatry, tzipoy nami lo mitzar. So therefore, the covering also does not become asr. Va'alehem dikra apsili Eloheim telushin koi. And I will say, what about the alehem? Bless you. The alehem is not referring to coverings; rather, the alehem is referring to what? Is referring to the idols situated on top of the mountain. So therefore, the Gemara suggests, although the Tanakama Yossi seem to be saying the same thing, in fact, at the core of their machlokes is tzipoy har. The mountain is covered in gold. What's the status of the gold? Tanakama holds that it's not like the mountain, therefore it's asr. Rabbi Yossi says it's bottled to the mountain, like the mountain, and therefore mutter. Rav Sheshes says no. So Sheshes holds that in reality, everyone agrees that the covering of the mountain is not like the mountain. I will say, ultimately, remember, darshaning like the Tanakama, that alehem, kesef is zahav, alehem comes to include not just a separate and distinct idol situated on top of the mountain, but rather what? But even a covering, a gold covering on top of the mountain as well. So what's the machlokes? V'hacha, we'll say Amud Beis. V'hacha is actually very interesting. Be'ilan shenatu ulebasof avdu kamiflagi. We'll say, watch this. Watch this. So what are they arguing about over here? Both say the issue is as follows: if you planted a tree, and only began to worship it at some later time. Look at Rashi for just a moment. So say I planted a tree, not I. Somebody else, right? Reuven planted a tree, not for the sake of Avoda Zara, not for the sake of Avoda Zara. and ultimately, again, he only begins to worship it later on. So we'll say, remember, the paradigmatic case of an Asherah tree is a tree planted for Avoda Zara mitchilasa, from the beginning. In this case over here, I'm going ahead and I'm planting the tree without any specific kavanah, and ultimately only beginning to worship it later on. So the Gemara says, Tanakama Savar, so the Tanakama holds, so we'll say, actually, before we get to that, look at Rashi for just a moment. Ilan Shenatu, Tap Rashi, Mem He Amud Beis, 45b, first line. Lilan Shenatu, Shlo L'Shem Asherah, Ulevasof Avdu. The Shama the Tanakama, Damar Harimu Gvos Sharu. So we'll remember the Tanakama who says, the mountains and hills are mutter. Hu adin kol kiyotzi bahen shemichubarin v'lo haisa tchilasa la'avodas kochavim. So therefore, again, the Tanakama will say that the tree that is planted not for the sake of Avodah Zara initially, just stam a tree, and then later on becomes Avodah Zara. The truth is, Rabbi say that's just like a mountain, right? What's the case of the mountain? The mountain was there, not for Avodah Zara, it was just there, and then subsequently worshipped. So Tanakama holds that a tree planted initially for regular purposes, tree purposes, and then only later on worshipped is treated like a mountain. Therefore, again, just reading Rashi. So according to Tanakama, what is the Asherah which is Asur? So Shenatu mitchila lekach, the tfisas yad adam eno klum, ela imkein hi l'shem avodas kochavim. Aval nater garin shlo l'shem Asherah, inzu tfisas ede adam, hoil ve'yishait alav dait la'avodas kochavim. Haya umemati le mitachas kol itz ra'anan v'lo itz atzo. So we'll say Tanakama is of the opinion that essentially the mice, if a tree is planted initially just for stam tree purposes and later on is worshipped as Avodah Zara, so that tree cannot be transformed into a chefta of Avodah Zara. Why? Because he holds that at that point in time, that tree is like what? Is like a mountain or a hill. What about Tfisas Yad Adam? What about the fact that a person was involved in it? Tfisas Yad Adam only plays a role when the tree is initially planted for the sake of Avodah Zara. But if it was planted for absolutely no reason, just stam tree purposes, other arboreal intentions. Gabi, you didn't have that one, right? So then again, lemaisa, that's not called tfisas yidei adam bo, and therefore on both sides it is mutter. On the other hand, let's just read Rashi. Rashi kind of gives us the whole Gemara, so we'll just read it and then we'll see in the Gemara. Rabbi Yosef Lili comes along to say, Ilan shenatu garin afilu sholoshem asherah ulebasof avdu aser. So both say ultimately Rabbi Yosef says no. Even if you planted initially for just stam reasons, and then only later on do you go ahead and what? Do you worship it? That is not like the mountain or the hill. Why not? Because also Rabbi Yosef says at the end of the day a person created this tree. Because a person created it, ultimately again it has the ability to transform into Avodah Zara once worshipped. So I will say it turns out that according to this approach, well actually let's read it inside. So remember, this is Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes says, what are they arguing about? We'll say second line, Memhem with base. Tanakama Savar, Ilan Shanatu Libasof Avdu Mutter. Tanakama holds that if the tree was planted for just stam intentions, right? Not Avodah Zara, just planted stam, and then only worshipped afterwards, it is mutter. Why? Because again, the Tanakama treats that type of tree like what? Like a mountain or like a hill. What about Tfisas Yidei Adam Bo? Tfisas Yidei Adam Bo, Tanakama says, is only a principle applied when the initial planting was done for Avodah Zara purposes. Rabbi Yosef Lili says, no. Ilan Shenatu Lebasof Avdu Aser. Rabbi Yosef Lili says, no, even if the tree was initially planted just stam, without any specific intentions, and only worshipped afterwards, nevertheless, the tree will still be aser. Again, Rabbi Yosef Lili's logic, because he holds tfisas yidei adam bo, a person planted this. So even though initially there was no intention for Avodah Zara, since the intentionality for Avodah Zara comes later on, therefore halacha l'maisa that's able to transform the identity of the tree, and it is not like the mountain or the hill. So the Gemara says, Mimai, midiktoni seifa, mipnei ma ashera asura. Well, so remember again, what did the Seifa say? Why is an Asherah? Why is the Asherah tree aser? Because they will say the Asherah was planted by a person. And anything that is ultimately has human involvement in its creation, aser, which means that anything that has human involvement has the ability to evolve into a chafza of Avodah Zara, has the ability to transform ultimately into an object of Avodah Zara. The chosheyesh bo tfisas adam la'asuyemai. So we'll say, when the Mishnah says anything that has tfisas yidei adam, what does that come to include? My love la'asuye ilan shenatu ulebasof avdu. We'll say, does that not come to include this particular case of a tree that initially was planted for just stam tree purposes and later on ultimately was worshipped, to tell you that such a tree does have the ability to in fact become aser. Va'af Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Savar Ilon Shnatu Levasof Avdu Aser. And ultimately, again, even Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda holds that if a tree was planted initially, again, I will say for stamp purposes, and only worshipped later on, that it has the ability to become aser. Disanya, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mitoch. So Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says as follows: Mitoch shene'emar Elohehem al haharim v'lo haharim Elohehem. So we'll say, remember again. Now, just important to keep in mind, the pasuk itself only is the first phrase. The second phrase is the drasha on the pasuk. So the first phrase is God telling Klal Yisrael, wipe out all of the Avoda Zara. Like what? Like Elohehem al haharim, like their gods on the mountains. So the drasha of the Gemara is v'lo haharim Elohehem, but the mountains cannot become their gods, which teaches us that you can't transform a mountain into a chefza of Avoda Zara. Similarly, the Torah says Elohehem al agvos, their gods on the hills. And what do we darshan? V'lo gavos Elohehem. But ultimately, again, the hills cannot become their gods. So I would have said, Shomea ani tachas kol eitz ra'anan Elohehem, v'lo ra'anan Elohehem. So I would have darshan. The pasuk says, tachas kol eitz ra'anan, underneath every green tree. I would have thought that, what does it mean about saying? That which you find underneath the green trees, maybe they placed idols there, so that is Avoda Zara, v'lo ra'anan Elohim. But the tree itself cannot become Avoda Zara. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, v'ashereim tisrafun ba'ish. The pasuk says, and the asheros you shall destroy in the fire. So we'll say, you see over here that what? Torah Kedosha explicitly says that the trees are to be destroyed. Ela tachas kol eitz ra'anan lamali. So we'll say, if that's the case, then why do I need that phrase? You understand what's happening over here. The phrase itself is confusing. Meaning, I understand es Eloheim al haramim va'ala gvos. The Torah explicitly says, you shall destroy their gods, which are on the mountains and on the hills. So that gives me a clear indication that what? That the obligation to destroy Avodah Zarah is that which is on the hill, but not the hill itself, even if the hill itself is worshipped, even if the mountain itself is worshipped. Yet, when it comes to Asherah, what does the Torah say? The tachas kol itz ra'anan. So why are you using that notion of tachas? Tachas means what? Underneath the tree. So okay, I would have thought that what is the Torah telling me? The tree itself cannot become Avodah Zarah, but the idols underneath the trees can. But one second, the Torah itself says, Vashareim tisrafun ba'esh. Torah itself says that what? You have to destroy the Asherahs, which tells me what? That the Asherahs can become Avodah Zara. So what's going on? So if that's the case, suppose that the Asherahs can become Avodah Zara. So then why use lashon of tachas kol itz ra'anan hahu lichid Rabbi Akiva? We'll say that's come to teach us the din of Rabbi Akiva. What is Rabbi Akiva saying? Hahu lichid Rabbi Akiva hu dasa. Then Rabbi Akiva ani ovin va'adun lefanacham. Because we're regular both just quoting the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva came along and said, "I'll darshan the pasuk for you." Kamakom shata mosei agava v'givan asa. Rabbi Akiva says, Torah Kedosh Moshe is telling us when you come into Eretz Canaan, any place where you find a high mountain or a high hill, ve'etz ra'anan or a green tree, the sheyesham avodas kochavim. No, I will say that what? No, that there is Avodah Zara there. Which I will say is also fascinating. Tells you how rampant Avodah Zara was in Canaan before Klal Yisrael got there. They got there. That literally, again, unto Kadosh Baruch Hu says, if you see a mountain, there's Avodah Zara there. You see a hill, there's Avodah Zara there. You see green trees, there's Avodah Zara there. A lot of Avodah Zara. But Rabbanan, so the Rabbanan, Hi Hashem Tisrafun Ba'esh Mai Avdilei. So we'll say, what do the Rabbanan do with the phrase Va'ashrem Tisrafun Ba'esh? Right? What do they do with this phrase? So the Gemara says, Miboile Le'ilan Shenatu Mitchila Lekach. We'll say they understand this to mean, or to be a reference to, a tree initially planted for Avodah Zara purposes. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Nami Miboile Lahi. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, he also needs that pasuk to teach me Abosai. V'ashrem tisafun be'esh, to teach me that if a tree was initially planted for Avodah Zara purposes, then what? Then Lamaisa again it's aser. So where does he learn that out from? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Nami Miboile Lahi. Hachanami. Where can you have a situation where we'll call it the trunk, or the initial tree is mutter, but that which subsequently grows is going to be aser? Where can you have a case like that? Have Omer, Ilon Shenatu ulebasof avdu. We'll say that refers to a case of a tree that was initially planted, and then what? And then ultimately again was later on turned into Avoda Zara. So we'll say, let's just look at this drasha one more time. So Rabbi Yehuda understands the phrase Asherem Tiga De'un. So we'll say we have two psukim by Asheras. One tells me Asherem Tisrafun Ba'ish, burn the Asheras. The other pasuk says Asherem Tiga De'un, cut down the Asheras. Now, why do I need both cut down and burn? If you told me burn, I will say burn is pretty clear, right? Burn is pretty. You can't really interpret that multiple ways, right? It means destroy it. So I need to be told cut it down. Rabbi Yehuda says something fascinating. He says because there's a case of an Asherah tree which doesn't need to be burnt down. Which is that case? That's a case of an Asherah tree which was planted for stam purposes, subsequently worshipped. So we'll say what becomes asr. Now here again, this is going to be a topic in tomorrow's daf. We're going to see more. But what happens over here in a case like that is it appears that only that which grows after the Avoda Zara designation, in fact, becomes asr as Avoda Zara. So if a person worships an asher, tree was planted for stam purposes, a person worships it, only that which grows after the point of Avoda Zara designation ultimately becomes Avoda Zara. So that's why the pasuk says Ashrem Tigadeun. That in that kind of case, do you have to destroy the tree? No. What do you have to do? You have to cut off whatever grew after the Avoda Zara designation, assuming you're able to measure that in some way. So I'll say, therefore, it's two different psukim referring to two different cases, and therefore, Rabbi says from here is a clear raya that even a tree initially planted for mundane purposes and subsequently worshipped as Avoda Zara will in fact be asr. So the Gemara says, "V'ha'ashem tisufun be'ish kanasivla." I'm sorry. So ezu eish shegidu asr b'karam mutavi omer ilot shnatul basof avdu. So we'll say, what is the case ultimately again of the tree where the primary part is mutter, and only that which is cut off or that which grows afterwards is going to be mutter. So the Gemara says, "The heavy omer ilon shnatul basof avdu." I v'ha'ashem tisufun be'ish kanasivla. Tamuda, to which the Gemara said, but 1 second, but the Gemara is bringing the pasuk. The Gemara is bringing the pasuk Ashrim Tisrafun Ba'ish. Look at Rashi. Rashi is right across. Ashrim Tisrafun Ba'ish Nasiv. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Talmud Elamilsei. Ulameser Ilan Shnatul Basof Avdu. So the Gemara Balashon Ilu Lo Namar. So also listen to this. But yet the Gemara is bringing the pasuk of Ashrim Tisrafun Ba'ish, not the pasuk of Ashrim Tigadeun. To which the Gemara says Ilu Lo Ne'amar Kamar. We'll say here's how to read the Gemara. Ilu Lo Ne'amar Tisrafun Ba'ish. Had the pasuk not said you have to burn the Asherah, Hayisi Omer Hashem Tigadeun, I would have said you have to cut down the Asherah. What is that talking about? Be'ilon Shenatu Mitchila Lekach. Well, so I would have assumed that would, see, had the Torah not said Hashem Tisufun Ba'ish, and all it would have said is Hashem Tigadeun, I would have assumed that is referring to a tree which is initially planted for Avodah Zara. Lekach, Hashta Dichsiv Hashem Tisufun Ba'ish. We'll say now that we have two psukim, Hashem Tisrafun Ba'ish, Hashem Tigadeun. Therefore, I both say I have an extra pasuk. Asherehem, Asherem Tisrafun Ba'ish. We'll say it's the initial pasuk. What does that teach me? So that's the simple case, which therefore again has to be destroyed. So now, what do I do with the extra pasuk of Asherem Tigadeun? Oh, I could tell you, Asherem Tigadeun le'ilan shenato ulabasof avdu. Well, so that comes to teach me about a tree which was initially planted for regular purposes and subsequently worshipped. So the Gemara says, "My avdi le'lichid Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi." I'm sorry. V'Rabbanan, Hai v'Hashem Tigadeun me'avdi. So we'll say this is fine. So now, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, who hold initially for mundane purposes, and then subsequently worship it, that the tree becomes asr as Avodah Zara. So they're learning it out from the phrase Vashem Tigadeun. Fantastic. What about according to the Rabbanan, the Tanna Kama, who holds, I will say, if you plant the tree initially for regular purposes, and then what? And then worship it, that the tree remains mutter, right? The tree does not transform into Avodah Zara. So now, what do they do with the phrase Hashem Tigadeun? Rabbi say this is amazing. Have Hashem Tigadeun my Abdilei L'chid Rabbi Shmuel Silber. Rabbi say this is amazing. They use it for the Josh Rabbi Shmuel Silber. What does Rabbi Shmuel Silber say? Rabbi Shmuel Silber, Gidue Avodas Kochavim Kodmin L'kibush Eretz Yisrael. Kibush Eretz Yisrael Kodem L'bir Avodas Kochavim. Rabbi say this is amazing. So the Rabbi Shmuel Silber holds that in the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, there were two steps in the destruction of Avodah Zara. The first step was cutting down the Avodah Zara. Like literally, in the case of trees, cutting it down. Maybe in the case of idols, knocking it over. But then the primary objective was the conquering and capturing of Eretz Yisrael. After Eretz Yisrael is conquered and captured, then what? Then they went back and destroyed the Avoda Zara. So we'll say amazing Yisod. So what happens again? Gidui ovdi kochavim kodmin lekibush. So the knocking down or the cutting down of Avoda Zara, that preceded the conquering of the land. So as they're rolling through the land, so ultimately again they have to cut down, push down, knock over whatever they can. But they can't spend the time destroying it now. Because right now, again, there has to be kibush. So however, kibush Eretz Yisrael kodem lebir. I will say the conquering of the land has to precede ultimately again then the destruction of Avodas Kochavim. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Kidu Avodas Kochavim kodem lekibush Eretz Yisrael. Rashi says, "B'chnisasa nitztavu legado miyad." When we entered into the land, we were obligated to go ahead and what? We were obligated to go ahead and cut down the Avodah Zarah immediately. And after we conquer it, then you go back and you uproot it. So Shabbos say, it's an incredible yesod in life. There's sometimes, again, in the world of accomplishment, so there are different ways that a person has to pursue goals. Sometimes, again, a person has to focus on finishing one goal at a time, and sometimes a person has to go ahead and proceed, bless you, through a number of different life initiatives, recognizing that right now they're all about 70%. Right now they're about 70%, but I need the traction to keep going forward, and I'll find the time ultimately again to fill in the remaining 30% as well. There's not a right or a wrong mahalach in life. It mamish depends on what's happening. So you see, Klal Yisrael again, the goal was Avodah Zarah to be knocked out of commission. So come in, cut it down, knock it down. But the goal over here is kibush. The goal over here is to conquer the land. We can't, destroying Avodah Zarah, especially this volume of Avodah Zarah, would have taken a lot of time. The goal, as it stands, remember again, kibush and chiluk takes 14 years. So first go ahead and conquer the land, knock down Avodah Zarah as you're going through it, conquer it, then go back and destroy. So I'll say the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara goes weiter. So it's fine. The Tanya of Yosef, so we'll say, as now again, still same topic. As Rav Yosef says, you shall go ahead literally and destroy their mizbechos. V'hanach. So actually, at least v'nitastem, I will say, actually doesn't really means v'nitastem means you'll deconstruct. You'll deconstruct. V'nitastem, you will deconstruct their mizbechos. V'hanach, and leave it. V'shibartem es matzevosam, break their matzevos. V'hanach, and leave it. Hanach sakadaitcha. What do you mean leave it? Sreiva, why are you supposed to burn it? Rather, again, says the Gemara, Amrav Huna, Redof v'acharkach srof. Right? I will say, so Redof means pursue and then burn. The idea being, I will say, that there was a mandate here to conquer the land. So because of the mandate ultimately to conquer the land, therefore, again, the obligation was knock the Avodah Zarah out of commission, destroy the stones, deconstruct them as bechos, but then move forward. Don't take the time ultimately to burn it now. So the Rabbanan Haimi by Leila Oker Avodas Kochavim Shetzarach L'Sharish Achareha. I will say the Rabbanan ultimately used this pasuk to teach me that when you uproot Avodah Zarah, it's not just enough to destroy the object, but Tzarach L'Sharish Achareha. I will say Tzarach L'Sharish Achareha means you have to make sure to remove any vestige of the idolatry. So the Gemara says, where does Rabbi Yossi Yehuda learn that you have to go ahead and uproot the Avodah Zarah afterwards? Ultimately, again, we learn from the phrase that you shall destroy their name from this place. The idea being that it's not just enough to destroy the idol, it's not just enough to destroy the Mizbeach, but rather, again, one has to actively uproot all of the Avodah Zarah that's around. I will say, which again is an incredible yesod as well, because it teaches you, I will say that in general, we have this with midos also, or negative behaviors. Oh my gosh. Mazel tov. So, this is an incredible yesod. Somebody check his card, by the way. I trust it. So I just want to point out. So in this yesod, incredible musar and hashkafa, which is I will say the same way in Avodah Zarah, that it's not just enough to stop worshiping it or to destroy the mizbeach or to go ahead and to destroy the idol, but rather again, one of the shari shachara. Plus, in the world of negative midos also, we all have negative midos, we all do averos, we all do things. It's not just enough to stop the negative character traits or the negative behavior, but we'll say every behavior is rooted in something. Everything negative is rooted in something. It's not just enough to stop the behavior, but a person is tzarich l'sharish achareh. A person has to go ahead and ultimately, again, find the Shart Vart on Purim. So we'll say, so there's the koach of Purim. is very well known. Perhaps again the most quoted piece of Torah when it comes ultimately again to the Yom Tov of Purim is a statement in the Tikkunei Zara, where the Tikkunei Zara says that Purim is Yom Kippurim, that there's a power of tshuva today, that there's a power ultimately again of the ability to change. There's the power of the ability to go ahead and transform ourselves into something dramatic, something amazing, something beautiful. That's something. Mark it off. Something dramatically amazing. Okay. Usually I don't get rattled so easily. I'm used to hecklers. So Purim offers us this incredible and dramatically amazing opportunity for cathartic, comprehensive change. So I will say, the shaila is what is it? So the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, the Rebbe, says something absolutely amazing. And he explains that on Purim there's an amazing halacha. The halacha is that kol haposhet yad nosnin lo. That we know that the halacha is, under normal circumstances, somebody comes to collect their credentials, thank you. On Purim, the halacha is kol haposhet yad nosnin lo. If a Jew asks for money, you give them. How much you give them, that's up to your discretion. But on Purim, you have to give. That's the halacha. Kol haposhet yad nosnin lo. So the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, Rabbi Yitzchak also echoes the same yisod. So the Zara also writes that the same way that we observe halacha here, so the Rebbe Shalom observes halacha in Shemayim as well. If someone extends their hand, we give them. So in Shemayim, it's the same exact halacha. Kol haposhet yad. Whoever extends their hand, in the lashon of the Baal Shem Tov is apashet the hand. Whoever extends their hand to the Ribono Shel Olam, nosnin lo. Today, every other day of the year, even Yom Kippur, every other day of the year, so I extend my hand to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I have to earn that extension, so to speak. Right? I have to come before HaKadosh Baruch Hu with something. The greatness of Purim is the same way that if another Jew asks me for something, no questions asked, I give. So today, when I extend my pashat hand, when I extend my hand, the Baal Shem Tov goes on and he says something so beautiful. He says, this is mirames to, this is alluded to in the Megillah itself. What do we say? Actually, excuse me, I should say in Shoshanas Yaakov. What do we say in Shoshanas Yaakov? V'gam charvona zachor latov. Even if someone is a charvona. They will say, what's charvona? Charvona is from Lashon, the shorish of charav, of destroyed. Even if someone is broken, even if someone is tzibrachan, even if someone is spiritually compromised. V'gam charvona zachor latov. Today is a day of kol haposhet yad nosnin lo. Today is a day where if we extend our hand to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is no telling what we could accomplish. There is no telling how we can grow. I will say, I know it sounds strange because Purim, we often don't think of Purim as a day of aliyah. We don't think of Purim ultimately as a day of spiritual growth because there's so much simcha, and the simcha itself is a little bit like a little hololus. Sometimes it's a little bit of silliness, which is good. That's part of the nature of the day. It's an amplified, exaggerated simcha, and we're running around the Mishlach Manos, and all beautiful. So it doesn't really seem like a day of incredible contemplation. But I will say, but it is. And so we have to make sure to carve out the time today to just give our pasha the hand, to just extend our hand to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ribono Shel Olam, I know I'm not always here, and I know I'm not always connected, I know I'm not always doing the right thing. I'm a human being. I have my good days, I have my bad days, I have my peaks, I have my valleys. But today's Purim, I'm here. Today Purim, I'm going to have kavanah during my tefillos. Today Purim, Ribono Shel Olam, I'm going to daven for others. Today Purim, I'm going to daven for myself. Today Purim, ultimately, I'm going to try to figure out how to re-energize and how to reconnect with you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the great promise we have is kol haposhet yad. If all we need to do is extend our hand to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and if we do so, nosnin lo. We should be zocheh mirtz Hashem to make this a day of nesina, to make this a day of giving. We should be zocheh to make it a day of giving to others who are in need through matanos lavyonim. We should be zocheh mirtz Hashem to make it a day of giving, of achdus of giving through mishlach manos. We should make it a day of giving ultimately to ourselves by taking the time. Hopefully, maybe we're not rushing off to work as quickly if we have to go at all. Hopefully, we have a little bit more time to daven, a little bit more time to say Tehillim, a little bit of time just to focus on our Avoda Hashem. We give to ourselves a little bit in our ruchnius. Most of all, hopefully, we have the schus to be able to give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give of ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give of our time of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give of our neshamas to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and in the zechus of all of that giving, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu reciprocate. May this be a beautiful day of bracha, a beautiful day of hatzlacha. May the Ribono Shel Olam shower upon us. Kol mishalos libenu ad sheyivla sefsosenu.